Well, strange times call for strange videos. I'm making this video to make good on a threat. It has come to, well, virtually everyone's attention these days that Joe Rogan has been spreading misinformation on the internet. And after James Blunt threatened to release new music on Spotify if they didn't remove his medical misinformation, I thought the virtuous thing to do is obviously to join in and pressure Spotify. So I issued my warning, my dire threat, to make a video on Plato, specifically Plato's Republic, if they refused to censor Joe Rogan, which of course they did not do, which brings us to this video here. And what better subject to talk about in matters of virtue and censorship than Plato? Plato's Republic is an interesting book. It's Alfred North Whitehead famously said that all of Western philosophy is a footnote to Plato. And of course, he's mostly referring to the Republic, which is a fascinating and complicated and delightful book that really, philosophy gets a reputation for being very stodgy, very dry. You try to read Heidegger, you try to read Kant, you try to read, Nietzsche and his just pretentiousness. You try to read, Hegel and his just mind-boggling complexity. Plato is really quite a breath of fresh air compared to much of that. So, what is Plato's Republic actually about? Well, it begins with Socrates going to visit a festival. He goes down to the port of Athens to go see some novel games that hadn't seen before. And he runs into some friends along the way, and they start talking. He ends up talking with an old man about, how are you doing in your old age? Can you still have sex? Is it as terrible as they make it out, or are there some upsides to getting old? And the old man says, well, it's you think about different things than you used to. You're worried about the stories that you used to maybe dismiss when you were younger about what's going on in the afterlife. And he says, old age has treated me quite well. And of course, some people may say that's because I'm wealthy. And he says, well, yes, wealth is nice, but mostly wealth is nice so that you can die without any debts, he says. And this starts a whole conversation about justice. What is justice? What's the advantage of being just? Or is it better to be unjust? And here a very interesting character enters the fray. Thrasymachus. Thrasymachus is a sophist, and he is a believer, a very forceful, very aggressive believer that might makes right. And he says justice is nothing other than what is advantageous to the stronger, is his position that he argues. And all of Book 1 is really Socrates attempting to deal with this. And he lays a bunch of equivocating word traps for Thrasymachus and gets him all tied up and frustrated. And by the end of Book 1, Thrasymachus has thrown up his hands and said, I'm not going to do this anymore. You guys have fun, and I'm going to go have fun elsewhere. But Book 2 begins with some of the other people there aren't really satisfied with how that conversation ended, and Socrates isn't satisfied either. And so they say, well, we've been talking about justice and injustice as they relate to, the advantage it brings. And everyone has praised, justice because it gives good social benefits. You're trusted, you get good relationships with others. But the perfectly unjust man would be able to, through his deceptions, be able to come off and appear to be the most just man. And so is there any argument, Socrates, that justice is good intrinsically rather than extrinsically, rather than as a means to some other end? Is there some reason that justice is good for its own sake? And Socrates says, well, this is a very difficult question. It'll take keener eyes than you or I have to really delve into it. But imagine if we had some analog. Imagine if we had a larger version than just an individual to look at in order to analyze the nature of justice, and then from that larger view we could get a better bearing on the nature of justice and why it might be an intrinsic good. And the analog he has in mind is a city, and so begins the conversation about the just city, and they build it really from the ground up. How are we going to clothe these people? How are we going to get food? Well, we'll need a farmer. Well, that farmer will need some tools. Okay, well, that blacksmith will need to be fed, and so on and so forth. And they build up this whole city, and in this growing metaphor, which we began quite explicitly as an analog for which path should an individual choose, the life of justice or the life of injustice? Which path should the individual choose? They design a city, which is and this is where Jonathan Rauch and Karl Popper's literal take comes into play. They end up with this city that is kind of a totalitarian caste system, where everything is laid out. Basically, the occupants of the city have no choice in their lives. They're born into a trajectory where the strongest are laborers and the smartest are intellectuals, and the people who aren't really good for much else become money changers and traders and businessmen and so forth. And of course, much time is spent around how the guardian class, or like the warriors, will be raised, and the education of them, and how their lives will be protected from corruption and so forth, including a campaign of censorship. Plato does eventually advocate the censoring even of Homer himself, whose themes are all throughout the book. So there's already some very, very playful self-contradiction going around if the metaphor is taken literally. But, of course, this book is not literal. It was explicitly a metaphor, but more importantly, the whole conversation about the just life of an individual is a sneak attack on Glaucon. So some interesting backstory. Glaucon isn't just a random character. Glaucon, who we read at the very beginning of the book, is the son of Ariston. Ariston is also Plato's father. So Glaucon is Plato's brother. Now Glaucon is, and here my source is Dr. Greg Johnson, who has a wonderful essay on this, on countercurrents. Just search Plato's Republic. And Glaucon had all of the characteristics of Alcibiades, one of Socrates' more ill-fated companions, a man so charismatic it literally killed him. Here Count Dankula is the source to go to on Alcibiades' life. But so Socrates was tasked by Ariston, by Glaucon's family, to talk him out of his political ambitions, to try to curb his passion for the public square into being a more private person. And this is the conversation that ensues in Socrates attempting to talk Glaucon out of it. And of course, I think it's worth quoting one of the passages at the end that really summarizes the whole purpose and nature of this book, which is of course not about cities at all, but about individuals, and certainly not about individuals trapped in a city where they have no choices. It is exactly about the choices that individuals have in the life that they can choose. Now here, my dear Glaucon, is the whole risk for a human being, as it seems. And on this account each of us must, to the neglect of other studies, above all see to it that he is a seeker and student of that study by which he might be able to learn and find out who will give him the capacity and the knowledge to distinguish the good and the bad life, and so everywhere and always to choose the better from among those that are possible. He will take into account all the things we have just mentioned, and how in combination and separately they affect the virtue of a life. Thus he may know the effects, bad and good, of beauty mixed with poverty or wealth, and accompanied by this or that habit of soul, and the effects of any particular mixture of one another of good and bad birth, private station and ruling office, strength and weakness, facility and difficulty in learning, and all such things that are connected with a soul by nature or are acquired. From all this he will be able to draw a conclusion and choose, in looking off toward the nature of the soul, between the worse and the better life, calling worse the one that leads it toward becoming more unjust, and better the one that leads it to becoming juster. He will let everything else go, for we have seen that this is the most important choice for him in life and death. He must go to Hades adamantly holding to this opinion, so that he won't be daunted by wealth and such evils there, and rush into tyrannies and other such deeds by which he would work many irreparable evils, and himself undergo still greater suffering, but rather he will know how always to choose the life between such extremes, and flee the excess in either direction in this life, so far as is possible, and in all of the next life, for in this way a human being becomes happiest. Now, I find myself in a strange position of someone who has not read Plato's Republic in 10 years. I've been rereading it the last 2 weeks. But, and yet I've become strangely qualified to speak about it, because the reason I think that many liberal philosophers and thinkers, and here coming chiefly to mind are Jonathan Rauch, author of Kindly Inquisitors, one of the strongest arguments and defenses for liberalism I've read recently. Can't recommend it highly enough. But also Karl Popper, the author of, among other things, The Open Society, which is dedicated in large part to repudiating Plato, or repudiating an imagined Plato that he thinks he has read but has not. And this sort of misreading is chiefly the byproduct of misunderstanding the genre of what the Republic is. If you read a history book and interpret it as a novel, you will misunderstand what's going on. Conversely, if you read a novel and mistake it to be a history book, you're going to run into problems. People read Plato's Republic and imagine it is an argument. And they imagine that it is an advanced position made with reason and logic towards this city-state. And the Greek word for this, ironically, is logos. It is the native language of science and of journalism, or at least used to be, and it is the language of most serious philosophers making serious philosophical arguments, a la Karl Popper or Jonathan Rauch. But that is not what Plato is doing. What Plato is doing is a different genre, a different mode of speech entirely, called Einos. Now, the best explanation for Einos that I know comes from Dr. Greg Nosh, phenomenal philologist, linguist, and historian, really, of ancient Greek culture and religion. And he basically describes Einos as an intentionally cryptic and ambiguous mode of speech, often where the intended meaning is not clear to the hearer, unless the hearer is qualified morally, intellectually, and in his mental connection with the speaker. And even then, it won't necessarily be clear until a certain signpost is reached, until a certain decision point arrives after the speech has already been made. And the true meaning of the Einos speech becomes clear. We see this in the Iliad, when Phoenix attempts to persuade Achilles to take Agamemnon's reconciliation offer, unsuccessfully. We see this with Tiresias explaining to Odysseus how he will arrive home and how he will achieve his true nostos, his true homecoming, with this very strange cryptic message about carrying his oar across the land until he finds people who don't know the ocean. And it's almost always an old man speaking down to a younger man, literally condescending, but doing so in a way that respects the extremism and the passion of the youthful soul. The skillful Einos doesn't just rebuke the young person, but they take that energy and they redirect it. And it's almost always towards a path of moderation, as Phoenix, and attempting to encourage reconciliation with Achilles, with moderation and reconciliation. One could say that Tiresias was guiding Odysseus towards a kind of reconciliation with Poseidon when he encouraged him to make sacrifices at the end of his journey home. And that is exactly what we see with Plato's Republic. From the opening words, "I went down," which is a signal, it's a sign, it's a callback to Odysseus descending into the underworld. Many of the people in Plato's Republic had died quite recently before he wrote this book. He has dead men speaking with each other in this story, which gives it an almost necromantic feel, like recently deceased. In some cases, Polemarchus was executed, if memory serves, one of the characters in the book 1. And it's a throwback to Odysseus descending to speak with Tiresias in this way, referring to an Einos. And, of course, the whole conversation about the city is cryptic. The back and forth feels very ambiguous. In many places, it isn't clear whether the just life or the unjust life is superior. And it all culminates in priming Glaucus to, at the moment of choice, to choose the life of the private individual, to choose the life of Odysseus rather than the public hero, the Achilles, who opted with the short life and regretted it. He said to Odysseus he would rather be a slave to a slave, essentially, a servant to a tenant farmer among the living, than king of the dead, in an exact inversion of Satan from Paradise Lost. Better to reign in hell than serve in heaven. And so, if you want to learn more about Einos and about this mode of speech, and about the choice between being a hero, one might say, or a more private man, following the path Plato has guided the young man towards. And the reason I might be strangely qualified to talk about this, you might check out The Hero and the Man, which is not about Plato's Republic at all. It is about the Iliad and the Odyssey, but it is exactly about these two archetypes, these two choices laid out before young men. And about, and related to that, the language of those two characters, which also explains why it is so easy for people who are literal in their readings of these things to misunderstand what Plato is doing. And perhaps after reading this, we will be in a better position to gauge the virtue of censoring podcasters or conversations, or, as Plato suggests, seriously or maybe not so seriously, even poets as great as Homer, or dialogists perhaps like himself. Anyways, I hope that's some encouragement for people to read it, to take some wisdom and satisfaction in reading it. As Dr. Johnson says, it's sort of the mark of an educated person to have read Plato's Republic, and it's an uncommonly edifying read among the greats.